Hello everyone, and welcome to the third part of the series in which we sew the Vogue V1659 pattern. In this part we're actually going to finish the blouse. Because last time we ended up with a fitting bodice, but now we need to add all the extra stuff like the sleeves, the cuffs, the collar, all the buttons. So that's what we're going to do in this part. I hope you enjoy it. I do have a small request. This video is edited completely different from the previous two, and I would like to know which style you prefer. So let me know in the comments and enjoy the sewing. So we'll start with pasting the collar pieces together. So in the instructions it says paste the sections together and then stitch. As you might have noticed, I'm pretty much too lazy to now paste it and then stitch it. It's not how it's supposed to be done and makes it slightly less neat, but yeah, I'm lazy like that. Now it's stitched, that means that we can remove the pasting here and we can turn it, and then I'll give it a quick press. What I find a bit weird is that they want me to press the seam open and trim it afterwards. I'd say trim the seam then press it open. I guess having a longer seam means you can press it more easily. I always got taught if you have edges, you stitch them from beginning to end. But I think right now what I should have done is just stitched it from here to the point. Because right now I can't press it open. I can fudge it a bit, but not a lot. I backstitched over the seam though, so maybe I can just cut away the excess stitches. We'll see. I'll just try and do something, I guess. I'll just see how well it goes with stitching it, with pressing it open, and then we can trim it afterwards. Again, I am in dire need of a tailor's ham, I guess. Well, this will have to be trimmed anyway. Maybe I should have trimmed and then pressed. Because I think right now, because of the cut corners, I can press it open. Turn collar right side out and press. So I really don't get why they wanted me to press the seams open. Right now the collar is weird. The pattern confused me again. They want me to turn it right side out and press, and then with the uninterfaced side up press the edges of the collar. Then why didn't they mention that with step 27? Oh well. This point is actually quite crisp. There's a kind of weird thing in it, but I guess that's okay. This one is not too good, but oh well. The couture tip says to use very short back stitches to understitch the edges. It shows it only on one side, but doesn't say which side. So I'm not sure whether it has to be done on both sides or not. Okay, I think I got it. They want me to backstitch the wrong side of the collar, so the side that will eventually fall back towards the shirt. I was doubting whether I had to do the back stitches all through, but this picture made me think that only one side had to be done. And then I was doubting, should it be the front or the back? And I guess they don't want it visible, but then I saw very tiny here. I'm not sure if you can see that. Well, anyway, in this picture there is a tiny stitch line, and that's the side that will be falling back towards the shirt, so that's the side that has to be backstitched. So then, on to the next challenge. I have never backstitched before. I know how it's supposed to be done, and I'm the idiot that doesn't like doing practice pieces. No, I immediately just grab the final product to stitch stuff on. Let me see. I guess what they want me to do is to catch all the seam allowance. So that's what I'll try to do. I am not a hand sewing prodigy. I'm actually starting to like hand sewing, but I just haven't done it a lot before. I guess that spacing, not sure if you can see it, I guess that spacing is way too much. Okay, so that has been backstitched. I'm sure it's the spacing between the stitches is a bit bigger than with the usual backstitch, but overall I think it's quite okay. I mean, the spacing is even. It's just that the spaces are a bit bigger than they're supposed to be, I guess. But for a first backstitch, I deem it okay. So now we're on to working on the collar band. But apparently I basted these both the other way around. For this one it's the side with a cut open basting threads, that's the right side, and for this side the non-cut basting threads is the right side. This is why you try and baste always on the wrong side or always on the right side. I keep doing that wrong, so that makes me confused on what's the wrong and what's the right side. Anyway, the next step is to turn the seam allowance in and then pin it and then baste it. We will be basting that one because it's not a immediate stitching line, and basting it will help it stay in its place while we're working with it. And here is where they want me to pin what to what part starts. They want me to pin the uninterfaced collar band to the interfaced side of the collar. And I do assume that is right side to right side. The other way around. So like that. Then they want me to pin and baste the interfaced collar band to the uninterfaced side of the collar. And then the uninterfaced collar band to the interfaced side. So then I have this one from here, like that. So yesterday we ended up with this, the uninterfaced collar band stitched to the interfaced side of the collar. The next step now is to pin the interfaced collar band to the uninterfaced side of the collar, and then to baste that. They say to just baste the interfaced collar band to the uninterfaced side of the collar, but if I look at the pictures they also want me to, well, finish it, so also baste and stitch the interfaced side of the collar band to the uninterfaced side of the collar band where it sticks out from the collar. It doesn't say that in the text, but I can see that in the pictures, and in the next steps they don't tell me anything about attaching those parts either, so I guess that's what they want me to do now. So let's do that. So this time it is basting and stitching so that this all gets sewn together, and then we can flip it outside and attach it to the bodice of the blouse. Now that this is all pasted together, we can stitch it. So it says to stitch it to the collar. It just says stitch, trim, press. As you can see, there's lots of loose threads here, so I think I'm going to trim it and then quickly zigzag stitch this edge together, because this will all be flopped over anyway. And it might become slightly more bulky, but I don't want this to eventually lose so many threads that it starts to break. So the collar band has been zigzagged on the inside. So that means that now we can press it. For that, we'll flip it over. And then we'll press it. And there we go, one crisp collar. Then it's time to pin the interfaced collar band to the neck edge of the shirt. For that there are also, again, some of the green markings. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those first have to line up, and then we can pin the rest. Again, because this seam is on the slightly trickier side, I'll baste it first and then I'll stitch it. And yes, I could pull out the floofs, the thread markings, just after basting, but I have a slight tendency to not sew correctly the first time. When I would have pulled out the thread marks, I wouldn't know anymore where to sew. So this way, even when I make a mistake, I can redo it, but yes, it does mean that I have slightly more trouble pulling out the thread marks. So that has been basted together. Now we can sew it together. So I did in fact sew it from the other side, and I think I'm really happy that I did that, because otherwise I would have problems with folding up and bunching fabric. So as you can see, it's now neatly sewn on both sides. Right now I'm going to iron this edge towards the collar band so that eventually this part will fold over here and we can nicely stitch this by hand over here. But first we'll actually have to iron it. I'm still not actually good at ironing stuff, but eventually we'll get there. So right now, again, it's removing the floofs, trimming, and then next up it's hand stitching this part over here. So I have decided to zigzag these edges, just because, well, the other side's already zigzagged anyway, and this is going to go over it, and well, it frays so much. So I will zigzag this. But first, let me just trim it a bit. And then next up we can fold this over, pin it, and then slip stitch it. Yep, so they really want the collar band to come over the seam. So that means that we can't just slip stitch this to the seam allowance. No, it's really gets slip stitched to... Wait a second. This back part is double. Which means that I could slip stitch it just to one side, that you really don't see it on the other. Maybe we'll try that. Let's see. Let's see if it works. While pinning this, I noticed that it's going to be very, very difficult not to have the slip stitch show up on this side. On the other hand, the collar will always be folded over it. So, I'm not sure if that's even a problem that the stitch is visible from the other side. I think we're only gonna give ourselves way much work if we want to do it single layer only. So I have decided to just slip stitch through all the way. Apparently it's still possible to make the stitch invisible if I just pull it through, well, right on the seam. Which is nice, because that means that I can catch slightly more than one thread at a time. And even though I catch more than one thread, it's still pretty much near invisible. Well, this one is slightly visible. This is what it looks like after the slip stitching. So yeah, it's not great, not terrible. I should have folded it here a bit better. You can see the seam is quite big here. But this is what it looks on the inside. On the outside, hardly anything's visible. Which is a good thing. So when the collar folds over it, you really won't see a thing. And I mean, this hand stitching is on the inside of the collar as well. So you won't see that either. It's just something I can annoy myself about for it not being perfect. So today we're going to start on the sleeve, which is the last big part of this blouse. It's quite an intricate sleeve, well, with the cuffs and the slashes and the... Yep, this is a mess. But let's see if it's slightly less of a mess once we've cut everything apart. There we go. Now we have to slash this line. So it is the middle line that has to be slashed up till here and then up to the yellow. Look. This is what it looks like on the pattern. So the middle line is the slash line. And then that has to be slashed those ways as well. I marked the circles with yellow thread. So in the chaos that is all this thread marking, it is the middle line up until the green split off lines, and then follow the green line up to the yellow lines. And that's usually why I use multiple colors for thread marking, because if I would have done this all in white, I don't think I would have been able to see what was going on there. Now the scary part. So first off, I should make a narrow hem on the right side. And then stitch it with small slip stitches. This is for me also the very first time making a sleeve with a placket. That was slip stitching one side. I think it actually turned out really nicely. You can hardly see any stitching on this side. Now that I'm here at the top anyway, let me quickly overcast this edge, because well, this fabric is still very prone to fraying. And I don't think a lot is gonna happen with that edge, so I don't trust it to just leave it this way. There we go, one edge, nicely finished, I think. That looks quite good. So those seams have been stitched over, and right now we can start on the placket. What I also did was just to iron this triangle up to the right side of the fabric. So to start on the placket, we need to turn it over so the wrong side is facing us again, and then with the wrong side up, pin the placket to the remaining opening. This has to line up, and then we stitch it from here to here. So I went ahead and stitched the placket to the sleeve. I pressed this seam over, and I pressed this seam and basted it. So now it's up for a bit of a finicky part, because everything the instructions say is with the wrong sides together, fold the placket along the fold line, baste the long edge. So then I would expect just to have to do this. But somehow it also shows me to flip it over to the other side. But it never explicitly mentions it. Well, we can just baste this, I guess, and then flip it over later. I guess that doesn't really matter. So let's just go ahead and baste the long sides of the placket together. And then here we have to be careful, because for now we should not stitch this or baste this to the sleeve yet, because we still have to do some folding over here. And that becomes a bit more difficult the moment that it's flat against the sleeve. So there we go. Let's baste this. Long edge is basted together, but it's not attached to the sleeve yet. What I see that they did is they turned this around, then flipped this over. Well, this is finicky. Something like that. There we go. And we can just flip it over to this side. I just realized that because I didn't know what they were doing either, but now that I'm actually doing it, it makes sense. They flip it over to the back because this will be stitched to here, so it doesn't matter that it actually, well, shows up on this side, because the placket can only be visible till here, because it will, this part will be stitched to the sleeve. So this is attached, and only the bottom half, the back, will be visible. So we can actually just flip it over instead of having to put the seam allowance on the inside of the placket. That's pinned over well, so let's baste that as well. So now the top part of the placket is basted as well. It says on the outside to baste the upper edges of the placket to the sleeve along the placement line. Edge stitch along the seam upper edges and fold, ending at the large circle as shown. Stitch along the stitching line between the small and the large circle. So what they want me to do right now is to stitch along this line to the top. Stitch here, stitch here, stitch here, stitch there. After stitching and pressing and removing all the basting threads, we end up with 2 stitch plackets. They're not the neatest, I agree. It's a bit wonky over here, but all in all, I'm actually quite happy with them. So yes, as immediately as you remove all the tracing threads, it becomes a lot clearer of what the idea actually is. After that, all we have to do is make the pleats in the sleeves. You see the yellow line and you see the white stripes. Yellow line goes on yellow line, white stripe goes on white stripe. So for that we pick this up, fold this over, and pin it in place. It's too bad that the yellow thread tracing is gone on this part, but I can still see the holes where the thread tracing used to be. So that's one. And that's the other. then all we have to do is baste this in place around here and at the bottom. And there we go, one set of nicely ironed pleated sleeves. Now that the placket and the pleating is done, it's time to actually make this flat piece of fabric into a sleeve. Like that. There are the sleeves. I stitched the seam together, I pressed it open and then zigzagged both sides individually, because later on when the sleeve has to be set into the bodice, they wanted to be done with seam allowance split open. It is time to start on the cuffs. For the cuffs we grab one of the parts with the interfacing, basically pin them to the bottom of the sleeve. It says that the circles need to line up well with the edges, and that the square that was on the pattern piece needs to line up with the sleeve seam. Now I have not necessarily traced them as squares and circles, but well, this was the square, this was the circle. You see, it doesn't say anything about this line, but I guess that's used to line up the other cuff piece later. So the seam allowance sticks over this opening in the sleeve. One goes there. So now we get to stitch this, trim it, and press the seam towards the sleeve. 2 halves of cuffs, I stitched them, I trimmed it, zigzagged it, but I did not press it yet. Because in the instructions they say that I have to press the seam towards the sleeve. So to me, I imagine that that means flipping this backwards and then, well, pressing the seam towards the sleeve. But to me that feels contradictory, because for the other half, I first have to baste and stitch the seam allowance to the inside, stitch it on the bottom, flip it back over, and then slip stitch this over. But then I want the seam to go towards the cuff. So why would I have to press it to the sleeve then? I guess I'll just leave this for now and not press it at all. That also means that we are ending up on the last bit of instructions. This is French, I can ignore that, I don't speak French. So we're starting to get there. But first, I'll just baste this. This part says to baste the right sides together, pin the uninterfaced cuff to the interfaced cuff, baste, stitch, trim. Then we pin and stitch this part. And after that we can flip it over and slip stitch it to the inside, in which we will flip the seam allowance down. So I still don't get why they wanted me to iron it towards the sleeve, but still, we'll see about that. For now, let's just attach this piece. I might just baste this part before I stitch it, because it's not just a straight line. The cuffs have been turned and ironed, and especially with stuff that has interfacing in it, I love how crisp it turns out after ironing. We're starting to see how it's going to look like when it's finished, and I'm just very happy with it, how nice and crisp and everything looks. But before we're going to set the sleeves into the bodice, first the inside of the cuff still has to be slip stitched to the rest of the cuff. I see now that the seam allowance hasn't been ironed down yet, so that's what I'm going to do first. So after ironing the seam allowance down, it's now time to slip stitch this entire inside of the cuff to the sleeve. Well, that's one slip-stitched cuff. To be honest, well, when I started this project I had never slip-stitched before. But now, even on the inside, I think my stitches are getting quite even. And on the outside, I think it looks pretty good as well. Well, it is of course visible, and maybe I should have stayed a bit closer to the stitching line here. But overall, I think, especially here, I think it looks quite good. Well, of course I had some places where I could cheat, like here, here, and here, because, well, I just slip-stitched only through the inner layer of the fabric. And now it's time for the next interesting part and the last, what I'd say, very big step of making this blouse. That is to put the sleeves to the body. Yeah, because after that all the pieces are together and it's just finishing. Finishing can be a whole lot of work on its own, but still, all the pieces are together, so it's a wearable blouse. So yes, let's set these sleeves. For that I turn the blouse inside out. I don't turn the sleeve inside out. I'm not sure if this is the right sleeve, but we'll see. And let's just put the sleeve through. I think this is the right sleeve. This will be one of the seams that I will be basting instead of just pinning, because sleeves are difficult. You want them to be right, and a lot can move under the sewing machine, so well, let's first line up these, because I know for sure that they should go together. Pulled out quite a lot of thread tracing here, so at least we still have the fabric edge to measure how far it should go. Let's see. This is the reason that why sleeves are hell, because the sleeve part always has more fabric than the armhole part. That's to make sure that when you move, there is enough space to actually move, and that does make it a hell to put together. My guess is that this should go here. The weird thing is, it doesn't say anything about the small circles. It just says pin the sleeve to the arm side, matching large circle to the shoulder seam, baste, easing sleeves slightly to fit above the notches. That's it. Nope, this does not look. Maybe this should line up with the... No idea. Let's just start with the bottom, because I know for sure that this should line up. Also, this is the inside, this is the outside, so I'm pinning the inside to the outside. That's not supposed to go. That also makes sense why this doesn't fit. Aside from the notches, what also has to line up is the seams at the bottom. So it's the sleeve seam and the side seam of the bodice. And this will be a quite obvious one if it's not exactly correct, because you can see it after sewing. Well, and then we have to make sure that all this excess fabric is somehow nicely evenly divided. So now I'm going to pin this entire line, and then we're going to baste it, and then we can stitch it. So I figured out I was doing something wrong, halfway to pinning luckily. I matched the large circle at the top to this seam, which left a lot of extra space in the sleeve on this side, and not all that much on that side, which I thought weird. And we still had this marking that we didn't do anything with. lifting the blouse up, I noticed that this is actually the top of the shoulder. So the big circle here should be matched to that, and that leaves us with two reasonable sides. There still is a lot of fabric that has to be eased in here, but this is doable. The only annoying thing is that the instructions say match the big circle to the shoulder seam, but on this garment there is no actual shoulder seam. Anyway, luckily I managed to clear that up before basting or actual stitching, so now I'm just going to continue to pin this all around, which also means that this circle matches up to there, I notice right now, which is nice because then I can pin that there as well. Both sleeves have been basted and we can finally start to see an idea of what it looks like when it's finished. There's of course a lot of finishing work to do, but first we're actually gonna stitch those sleeves. The sleeves are in, and they were actually less of a hell to put in than usual. I think they're in quite nicely, and what I'm also really happy with, both sides line up really nicely at the side seam and the bottom seam of the sleeve. So after this I will be removing all the basting thread, trimming the seam allowance down, and then overcast the edges by hand. One side of the fabric has much more ease than the other. This will not become nice if you zigzag stitch it, so I will have to overcast this by hand. But for now, let's start with pulling out all of the basting thread. It already looks a lot neater with all the thread tracing removed. So now I can just trim away the extra seam allowance, and then I will overcast everything by hand. Which is great timing because in about an hour we have the Great British Sewing Bee again, so I will be overcasting while watching the Great British Sewing Bee. Which is the perfect combination of activities, don't you think? So both sleeves have been overcast and I have pressed the seam allowances towards the sleeves. I did this while watching some TV, and it immediately shows me the speed at which I can overcast, because one sleeve took me one episode of Great British Sewing Bee and the other sleeve took me one episode of something else. So I sew one sleeve per episode. Anyway, next up is the last bit of seam finishing, which is the entire bottom seam. What they want you to do is to turn the hem up, trim it, and then overcast everything by hand. Wait, turn up the hem, press, then use overcast stitches, and then sew the hem in place. I'd say overcast it and then press it, but there's probably a reason for that. Because my overcasting is not that neat. I guess it's okay, but still, because this fabric is rather prone to fraying, I prefer not to overcast a lot by hand, because as you can see it can still fray a bit. But I think I will use zigzag stitches to finish this part, because it will be turned up and no one will see it anyway. Time for some zigzags. Pretty much as expected, it turned out to be not the prettiest bit of zigzag sewing. If you just have a single layer of fabric, the sewing machine has a tendency to, well, kind of eat the fabric. It just rolls it up, and but all in all I think it looks okay. We're now going to flip it over and then stitch it. This is quite a big hem for this kind of clothing. Usually I would have expected something a bit more delicate, but so I decided after flipping the hem over to baste it, because this way I can actually see when I stitch it. I will stitch it from the right side of the garment, because That way I can make sure that the stitching line is always the same distance from the edge, and when I would stitch it from this side I might get influenced by where this ends, so that means that you get a wobbly line, which is something that we don't want. But this way I can see where the seam allowance ends. This way I can make sure that I always catch the seam allowance. But to make sure that we actually stitch in a straight line, I have to see where the smallest seam allowance is, because that will be the distance that we use for stitching. So that means that we will stitch 7 centimeters away from the edge of the garment. And after stitching a quick press and removing all the thread tracings, the lowest seam looks somewhat like this. It's not the neatest seam, but I'm quite happy with it. At least the stitching line is pretty even at the same distance from the hem, so that's what we want. Again, the blouse is one step nearer to completion. I think that now all that is left is make the last few buttonholes. Yes, we still have to make the buttonholes in the collar and in the cuffs. We have to attach all of the buttons and then slip stitch this lower bit of fly together, because the buttons only start up here. So today it's time to start on the buttonholes for the cuffs. When I thread trace the pattern pieces, I trace the line where the buttonholes have to be, but I did not trace where they had to start and end. So I already noticed that on this side the distance from the first part is 1 centimeter, and on this side it is 1.4. So we can look to these thread tracings to determine on which line the buttonholes need to be, but I still need to determine where the buttonholes actually have to start. Then I looked at the place where we will eventually put the button, and that is on 1.5 and 1.5. So I guess we also want the buttonhole to start at 1.5 at least. The buttonholes need to be about 1.5 centimeters long, so we can pin those as well. That's 1.5. So now we have to do the same thing as we did for the earlier buttonholes, stitch a box around it with the sewing machine, and then hand stitch the actual buttonhole. And just like with the other buttonholes, the edges will be quickly overcast with regular thread and then stitched with the buttonhole stitch into proper buttonholes with the nice silk thread. So that should be it, and we should have quite a bit of handwork ahead. This is the current status of the blouse. It's actually already looking pretty much near complete. Just put in the buttonholes on both sides of the cuffs, again by hand. So for now we can start on the buttonhole at the top here, and I guess to attach all the buttons. This is the state of the blouse right now. We have made all of the buttonholes. I have also inserted the buttons on the cuffs on both sides. And I've made the buttonhole and put on the button for the button stand. I've also measured out the locations of all the buttons that go on the front. So now most of the work that's left is to just put all those buttons on. All of the buttons are in, and it's looking good. I quite like the slightly shiny white buttons. I actually originally ordered grey buttons, I thought, but it turned out it were these. But I think they work quite nicely. That means that there are only 2 things remaining, which is to stitch, hand stitch this part of the fly closed, and then to clean it up to remove all of the remaining basting threads. So let's get on to hand stitching that bottom part. To make sure that the fly doesn't open up while wearing the shirt, the bottom is closed. But this last part of the blouse, this lower part, does not have buttons. So this could open up. So that's why we're going to close this. The idea is to catch a bit on one side and then a bit on the other side. Generally just making sure that the stitches are invisible. So eventually the entire thing will look like this. You can't see the stitches from either side and it just stays closed. There we go, that was the very last bit of stitching on the entire blouse. So now all that remains is to clean up all the thread tracing. I think it needs a very good thorough press. This fabric is unfortunately a bit more crinkly than I anticipated, but we'll see. So on to cleaning it up and giving it a good press, and then we can wear it. One nice fancy blouse for semi-special occasions and office wear.